My name is Gabby Krutsinger, and in this recorded presentation, I will be informing you on a specific part of the brain, its connection to music perception and performance, and how damage to that part of the brain impacts music therapy. The part of the brain I will be covering is the basal ganglia. In this presentation, there will be 5 questions that I will answer relating to the basal ganglia and its influence on music perception and performance, as well as its implications in music therapy. Here is a roadmap of key questions that I will dive into throughout the course of my presentation. Before diving into how the basal ganglia affects music perception, I will provide some background information on this part of the brain to help you get a clear understanding of what this part of the brain does. So, my first question is, what is the basal ganglia? The basal ganglia refers to a group of non-subcortical nuclei responsible primarily for motor control. It is interconnected with the cerebral cortex, thalamus, and brainstem. The group that makes up the basal ganglia includes the stratum, pallidum, subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. In my presentation, I will be focusing on the basal ganglia as a whole. This part of the brain is also involved in other roles such as motor learning, executive functions and behaviors, and emotions. It is the place in the brain where automatisms and movements are organized, such as driving, cycling, knitting, standing upright, keeping balance, and walking. As a result, the main role of the basal ganglia is the learning and selection of the most appropriate motor or behavioral programs. Thus, the basal ganglia is extremely important in motor functions within humans. These circuits support a wide range of sensomotor, cognitive, and emotional brain functions. This leads to my second point. What is the basal ganglia's involvement in music perception? Analysis research done by Jessica Grahn in the Music Therapy Perspectives Journal has helped confirm that regular and irregular sequences are processed differently, finding greater basal ganglia activity for asynchronous, regular tone sequences compared to irregular tone sequences. This means that the basal ganglia plays a part in recognizing and reacting to pitches played at the same time. This is important. However, the basal ganglia plays an even more important role in musical beat perception. Musical time is monitored not only by the cerebral hemispheres, but motor and perceptual timing is also associated with activities in the basal ganglia. In an academic article by Jessica Grahn, she looked into the neurobiology of rhythmic perception and the basal ganglia, specifically relating to beat perception. These findings are presented from a series of studies in her article that have specifically examined the neural basis of beat perception using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, in studying patients with Parkinson's disease. The fMRI data indicated that novel beat-based sequences activate the basal ganglia when compared to irregular non-beat sequences. Here I have a graph from the article that shows that the metric simple meters, which is the most commonly used meters in songs, engaged the basal ganglia in beat perception greatly. You can see that the basal ganglia's activation is much more present in the simple meters with the higher green marks on the graph. Furthermore, although the healthy participants in the study found it much easier to discriminate changes in the non-beat-based sequences compared to irregular sequences, the Parkinson's disease patients failed to show the same degree of benefit due to the disease. The data from these studies in the article suggests that the basal ganglia is performing a crucial function in beat processing. The results of an additional fMRI study indicate that the role of the basal ganglia is strongly linked to internal generation of the beat. This is because the basal ganglia activity is greater when participants listen to rhythms, in which the internal generation of the beat is required, as opposed to rhythms with strongly externally cued beats. Functional connectivity between part of the basal ganglia cortical motor areas is also higher during perception of beat rhythms compared to non-beat rhythms. Increased connectivity between cortical, motor, and auditory areas is found in those with musical training. So, the basal ganglia is not just active, it is required for successful beat processing. In addition to being more active during beat perception, the basal ganglia exhibits increased communication with other areas of the brain during beat perception. More recently, researchers observed that when listening to simple, predictable rhythms, healthy adults showed consistent bilateral activation within several structures of the basal ganglia. These studies demonstrate that listening to rhythm and tapping along with rhythm requires regular use of basal ganglia structures. And this leads into my third question. What is the basal ganglia's involvement in music performance? It has been proposed that the basal ganglia is important for interval timing at longer timescales. In simpler terms, this means that this part of the brain helps with being able to time intervals for long periods of time. This goes back to what I talked about earlier, mentioning that the basal ganglia is heavily involved in beat perception. So, as musicians, being able to feel the tempo regality in musical rhythm is a result of the basal ganglia. When a beat is perceived, predictions about upcoming events can be generated. This is especially important in music performance as a vocalist, instrumentalist, pianist, or percussionist, because you need to be able to feel the rhythm and timing of music accurately with precision. This also applies to being in ensembles with other musicians. The basal ganglia helps with the timing of rhythms, thus allowing each musician to contribute accurate rhythms in the ensemble music to create beautiful music together. Furthermore, neuroimaging studies have shown that the basal ganglia is active in tasks that require timed finger tapping. This shows that when engaging in rhythmic activities such as simply tapping your finger to the beat, the basal ganglia is activated. So, the basal ganglia is also related to motor coordination in musicians, connecting to beat perception. Being able to move or tap your finger to the beat relates to being able to play an instrument in rhythm. Very high levels of motor coordination are required for professional musicians, not only for an accurate rendition of the music, but also to enable it to be played with expression. The basal ganglia assists musicians to be able to connect both the motor and beat perception aspects of music to play an instrument. It has also been suggested that the basal ganglia may be involved in controlling specific parameters such as force, which contributes to accurate timing. It also connects to relative or beat-based timing. This affirms that the basal ganglia helps musicians with accurate timing when reading music and performing. High-level control of sequence execution appears to involve the basal ganglia. Human neuroimaging studies have also emphasized the contribution of the basal ganglia for well-learned sequences. This is from the Zatori Review of Neuroscience Literature. This is important because it shows that the basal ganglia also plays another important role in learning and memory for music. Well-learned relates to having a piece of music nearly memorized or completely memorized, and many musicians in performance are required to memorize their pieces of music. The basal ganglia impacts the memory of musicians in performance relating to rhythmic timing. To finish this section on the basal ganglia's involvement in music performance, it is safe to say that the basal ganglia has a significant role in rhythmic aspects of music performance. And this leads into my fourth question. What are the implications for music therapy with clients who have deficits with this part of the brain? Damage to the basal ganglia can result in several neurological disorders, including Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and cerebral palsy. These are possible clients that music therapists might work with, the most common being Parkinson's patients. So, when there is cell death in the substantia nigra, which is a specific section of the basal ganglia, it leads to reduced levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which then disrupts the basal ganglia's ability to communicate effectively with other neural structures. As a result, the individual will experience a number of movement deficits because of damage to this area. So, when dopamine receptors are not adequately stimulated, parts of the basal ganglia are either under or overstimulated. This causes a shutdown of motion and rigidness. This means that a client with damage to the basal ganglia could have trouble with playing an instrument because the basal ganglia is heavily involved in motor control and coordination, as previously mentioned. This could make it difficult for a client to play an instrument or move their fingers, hands, or body smoothly. Both rhythm perception and rhythmic execution of speech movements require basal ganglia activity. An example of a population with damage to this part of the brain is Parkinson's patients. In patients with Parkinson's disease, rhythm serves to prime and trigger the damage in the basal ganglia, thus promoting effective communication with other neural structures, such as the motor cortex. With this improved communication, the patient is able to produce timely and even movements, including movements needed for speech production. By understanding the role of the basal ganglia in regard to rhythm perception and speech production, there is an explanation of how music facilitates a therapeutic change in behavior. So, difficulty in speech could be another implication in music therapy for clients with damage to the basal ganglia. With this information and research I talked about, including music perception and the basal ganglia, the biggest implications for music therapy would be that a client with damage to this part of the brain could struggle heavily with beat perception. This definitely impacts how music therapy sessions would be conducted. A music therapy session with a client who has damage to the basal ganglia would not include complicated rhythms in music or irregular beats. The music therapist would need to have a steady and strong beat maintained when doing music therapy, especially if working on a goal of improving motor coordination. The music therapist would need to be in tune with the patient's needs, including emotional and speech needs, to make sure that there's no overstimulation with rhythmic patterns or phrases. And this leads into my final and fifth question. If you are working with a client who has damage to this area, how will that affect their responses to music therapy? A dysfunctional basal ganglia can inhibit projections to surrounding brain region areas that are involved in the synchronization of internal and external cues. With this inhibition, these brain regions may receive increased input from the cerebellum, compensating for the lack of signals coming from the basal ganglia. This can be deduced that even if the basal ganglia is damaged, a client could still be able to process instances of beat perception. However, the client will more than likely have difficulties processing and entraining to rhythms provided by a music therapist. Thus, it is important that a music therapist, when working with a client with damage to the basal ganglia, keep in mind that beat perception of a client will be different from those without damage. Common effects of damage to the basal ganglia includes tremors, bradykinesia, rigid muscles, uncontrolled repeated movements, and loss of automatic movements. As a result, a person with damage to this part could have difficulties with meter, pulse, matching rhythmic patterns, feeling strong beats, discriminating between rhythmic patterns, or moving to the music on beat. Depending on the damage and other factors, music therapy for someone with damage to the basal ganglia could have slower or delayed responses, or have rhythmic and speech difficulties responding in music therapy. Additionally, because of the basal ganglia's connectivity to memory and speech, a person with damage to the basal ganglia could also have trouble with music memory, singing, articulation, and slowness in speech. However, music therapy can be used with several different interventions to help with motor movement, internal beat, gait, speech, and even mood improvement for those with damage to the basal ganglia. This has been shown in several music therapy research studies done with Parkinson's patients. Like the previous studies I have mentioned in this presentation dealing with Grahn's study with Parkinson's patients and McIntosh's research study also dealing with Parkinson's patients that specifically focuses on gait, that show the positive impact of music therapy and how it can help people with damage to the basal ganglia. In summary, the basal ganglia is vital to motor function and movement. It also has impacts on emotional and cognitive brain functions. Because of the basal ganglia's significance in motor function, it heavily influences musical beat perception and how we respond musically to rhythm. The basal ganglia heavily impacts rhythmic aspects of music performance, including motor control, beat processing, interval timing, and even memorization of pieces. This information is important to understand when looking at the implications of music therapy when the basal ganglia is damaged. The biggest implication for music therapy would be that a client with damage to this part of the brain could struggle with beat perception, rhythm, speech, and memory. So, A client with damage to the basal ganglia could struggle with difficulties with meter, pulse, matching rhythmic patterns, feeling strong beats, discriminating between rhythmic patterns, or moving to music on the beat. Knowing this information can help music therapists create the best interventions possible for a client with damage to the basal ganglia. And this concludes my presentation on the basal ganglia and its impact on music perception, performance, and music therapy. Here are my references, and if you are interested in looking into the research I included in my presentation, it is in the video description below. They will also be alphabetized. Thank you for watching.